In Sinai, a rebellion shaped the destiny of the world. What they never explained to you is that golden calf wasn't just idolatry. It also involved the use of dark forces, witchcraft, and magic with metals and alchemy. Today you will discover with the Parashat Ki Tisa the ancestral struggle of the Torah against Avodah Zarah.
Shalom, shalom. Welcome, as always, to your home, your channel, Mishnah TV, where on this occasion we will study the Parashat Ki Tisa, which recounts a moment in biblical history that seems like a simple stumble, but in reality is a point of no return in the history of humanity. A moment when Israel, freshly out of Egypt, freshly having heard the voice at Sinai, decides that Moses' absence is too uncomfortable and asks for something tangible. Make us a God who will go before us. As Exodus 32 verse 1 states, and Aaron melts the gold, and the calf is born. But listen carefully. The problem is not only idolatry. It is something deeper. It is the human desire to manipulate the divine. It is the spiritual nostalgia for Egypt, where the bull Apis represented strength, fertility, visible power. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Exodus 32 verse 4 tells us. The text is unequivocal. It is not a minor theological error. It is a symbolic regression. And here something decisive occurs. Moses descends. He breaks the tablets. And as we explained in the Parashat Terumah, the first Torah, the one that contained absolute revelation because it was written by the finger of God, is shattered, hidden, compressed, concealed, leaving a second Torah, the one we have today. That is, a second revelation that is no longer simple but complex. The same message, certainly, but encoded, concealed, complex. Then the prophet Moses raises a question that divides history, though it also divided the people and the world, something that was not originally planned before the sin of the golden calf. The question was, whoever is for the Lord, come to me, as written in Exodus 32 verse 26. And all the sons of Levi gathered to him. That day there was not only a purge, there was an investiture. Today you have filled your hands for the Lord, milu yedkum, which is technical language of priestly consecration. According to Rabbi and preeminent Jewish exegete Rashi and the Midrash Tanshuma, Levi's zeal transforms them into guardians of the sanctuary, as explained in the book of Numbers chapter 3, where it is declared that the Levites replaced the firstborn for the priesthood. And in Deuteronomy chapter 10, this function is formalized. The Levitical priesthood is born as a response to a spiritual crisis rooted in the idolatry of the golden calf. Because the consequence of sin is distance from God, and therefore, as we have already explained, the Torah that was delivered, the second one, is more distant, more codified or concealed than the first version, which was broken by Moses. And here enters the thesis, the novelty, we will explore today. Witchcraft and idolatry are not separate phenomena in the Torah. Exodus 22 verse 18 states, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." In Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12, divination, sorcery, consulting the dead are forbidden. Why such severity? Because both the calf and magic share a common root, the presumption of manipulating spiritual forces. Biblical monotheism is not only believing in an invisible God, it is accepting that he cannot be controlled. Let me state it directly. The golden calf was not only an idol. It was witchcraft, black magic, the invocation of hidden forces, and all of this was learned in Egypt, the cradle of black magic. This is even documented by archaeologists and historians. After the calf, the Torah in its second revelation responds with a greater structure, more commandments, more priestly castes, more division, a regulated mishkan or tabernacle, a hierarchical priesthood, a codified sacrificial system, a sacred calendar. Access to the divine cannot be improvised. The Levitical priesthood centralizes worship, teaches the law, according to Deuteronomy 33 verse 10, and distinguishes between the pure and the impure, as written in Leviticus 10 verse 10. The priestly law, In Hebrew, Torat Kohanim is an institutional antidote against witchcraft. And if you stay until the end of this class, I promise you 3 discoveries that will change the way you read the Torah. First, you will understand why the laws of holiness for the Kohanim and Levites are designed as an anti-witchcraft system. Second, you will discover how the laws of the tabernacle and later the temple seek to eradicate idolatry from the ancient world, not only from Israel. And third, you will learn about the striking case of the witches of Ashkelon, a coastal Israelite city, an episode that reveals how real and concrete this struggle was. The Parashat Ki Tisa is not only a story of sin. It is the moment when Israel learns that spirituality without limits degenerates into magic, and that true holiness requires discipline, structure, and fidelity. And that, dear followers, is not a historical detail. It is a lesson for every generation that attempts to domesticate the spiritual by crossing permitted boundaries. This is Abel Flores, journalist and founder of Mishnah TV. I remind you that if you appreciate this content, please give us a like and visit our website lemishnah.com, where you will find much more material on Second Temple Judaism, Kabbalah, the Talmud, and our jewel, the complete and free course of the entire Mishnah in its 2 versions, the most comprehensive chapter by chapter, or the summarized version of each tractate. Choose the one that best fits your needs. Stay with us. We are just beginning. There is a prohibition that, at first glance, seems merely ritualistic, just another purity rule among many. But when we examine it closely, we discover that it is a theological declaration of war. Leviticus 21 verse 1 opens with direct words, "No one shall defile himself for the dead among his people." The Hebrew reads, "He shall not defile himself for the soul of one of his people." And here, a tension already exists. Because the dead person is called nefesh, soul, the Torah recognizes dignity, but imposes distance. Why? Because in the ancient world, death was not just mourning. It was a portal. In Canaan and Mesopotamia, consulting the dead was common practice. And if you know anything about witchcraft, you will know that this is the same today. Necromancy was not marginal, it was spiritual politics. Kings consulted spirits. Pagan priests manipulated human remains. Access to the afterlife was considered a source of power. The Torah unequivocally forbids it. In Deuteronomy 18 verse 11, the expression Deresh El Hamadim, consultant of the dead, appears, and it concludes, "It is an abomination to the Lord." Isaiah 8 verse 19 formulates it with prophetic irony. Should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Listen to the logic. Witchcraft seeks information and power in the realm of death. The Levitical priesthood represents service to the living God. They are 2 incompatible spiritual channels. That is why the Cohen has an almost absolute prohibition against contact with corpses, except for parents, children, and unmarried siblings. This is not contempt for mourning. It is spiritual architecture. Rashi comments on Leviticus 21 verse 1 that the warning is twofold. He must not only avoid becoming defiled, but also prevent others from defiling him. It is a guarded holiness. The Midrash Sifra in Emer 1 explains something profound. The priest represents life and atonement. Death symbolizes judgment and rupture. He who ministers at the altar must embody the continuity of life. He cannot be a mediator between the people and God if he is ritually linked to the realm of death. And here the anti-witchcraft dimension appears. In many ancient cultures, magical rituals used bones, blood, and human remains. Power was sought in decomposition. The biblical priesthood is defined in exactly the opposite way. Total separation from that sphere. Do not manipulate death. Do not use it. Do not instrumentalize it. Now let's take a more radical step. Leviticus 21 verses 10 to 12 states that the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, cannot be defiled, not even by his father or mother. Imagine the emotional force of this law. Not even a filial bond suspends his consecration. Why such severity? Because the Kohen Gadol embodies the pinnacle of spiritual life in Israel. He enters the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. He represents the people before the invisible God. Maimonides, in Hilchot Avel 2.6, explains that this separation symbolizes absolute dedication to divine service. It is not coldness, it is total consecration. Necromancy descends to the underworld seeking answers. The high priest descends to the heart of the sanctuary seeking atonement. One attempts to master hidden forces. The other submits to divine sovereignty. And here we understand something essential. After the golden calf, when Israel sought to materialize and manipulate the divine, the Torah responds by creating an institution that does not negotiate with death or magic. The message is clear. The legitimate channel to the spiritual doesn't pass through tombs, but through the sanctuary. Today, perhaps we don't consult mediums at the city gates, but we remain tempted to seek control where we should seek trust. We still crave quick answers, hidden access points, spiritual shortcuts. Levitical holiness reminds us of something both uncomfortable and liberating. Life is built from life itself, not from a fascination with darkness. And perhaps the question Leviticus leaves us with isn't merely ritualistic. It's existential. Where do we seek our guidance? From the anxiety that seeks to dominate the invisible, or from the discipline that learns to serve the God of life? Because true spirituality doesn't exploit death. It transcends it. Now, there are gestures that seem merely cultural until we understand what they truly mean. A cut on the skin, a mark on the body like a tattoo, a ritual baldness, mourning, identity, or something deeper. Leviticus 21 verse 5 states precisely, "They shall not make baldness on their heads, nor shave off the edges of their beards, nor make any cuttings in their flesh." In Hebrew, they shall not make any cuttings in their flesh. And this is not an isolated rule for priests. Deuteronomy 14 verse 1 extends the prohibition to all of Israel. They shall not make any cuttings or baldness for the dead. That is to say, mourning itself is being regulated. Why does the Torah concern itself with how someone expresses their grief? Because in the ancient world, mourning wasn't just an emotion. It was an invocation. In Canaan, in Phoenicia, in Mesopotamia, ritual incisions were magical practices. Blood was a vehicle for contact with spiritual forces. The body became an altar. Physical pain was offered as a channel of communication with the afterlife. Let's look at a chilling biblical example. In 1 Kings 18 verse 28, the priests of Baal cut themselves with knives and lancets until the blood flowed over them. This wasn't religious hysteria. It was a ritual technique. It was the belief that blood provoked a divine response. The Torah responds with a radical antithesis. The Israelite priest cannot adopt such gestures. He cannot turn his body into a magical instrument. He cannot dramatize mourning as an invocatory act. Nachmanides, the Ramban, comments that these practices were clearly idolatrous. These were not mere folk customs. They were an integral part of pagan worship. And the Sefer HaChinuch, in Mitzvah 253, adds something even more incisive. Israel must not appear to practice funerary magic. Spiritual identity is also protected through appearance. Let's pause for a moment. Ancient witchcraft used the body as a tool for spiritual manipulation. Cuts, ritual tattoos, permanent marks. The message was, I activate power through my physical action. The biblical priesthood teaches the opposite. Access to God is not obtained through human blood. The altar is already established. The service is already regulated. Spirituality is not improvised from wounds. There is a profound lesson here. In many cultures, self-inflicted pain was interpreted as spiritual intensity. The more extreme the gesture, the greater the supposed fervor. The Torah introduces moderation, restraint, dignity. The kohen represents balance, not uncontrolled ecstasy. It represents discipline, not trance. It represents an ordered life, not the theatricalization of suffering. And this is revolutionary. Because grief is one of the most intense emotions a human being can experience. The Torah doesn't deny it. It channels it. It doesn't allow pain to be transformed into a magical ritual. In structural terms, what we are seeing is consistent with the entire Levitical project following the golden calf. Israel cannot repeat the logic of Egypt or Canaan. It cannot seek spiritual power in manipulative gestures. Not through objects, like the calf. Not through corpses, like necromancy. Not through its own blood, like the Baal cults. Levitical holiness is sober. It is regulated. It is anti-magical. And here comes the uncomfortable question for our generation. Today, perhaps we don't hesitate to invoke Baal, but we remain fascinated by the spectacular, the extreme, the dramatic. We continue to confuse intensity with depth. The Torah teaches us something countercultural. Authentic spirituality doesn't need bodily displays or bloody theatrics. It doesn't need to manipulate the body to reach heaven. The priest doesn't wound himself to call upon God. He serves to hear God, and that difference changes everything. There are laws that make the modern reader uncomfortable, laws that seem merely social, until we discover they are protecting something far deeper than a genealogy. Leviticus 21 verse 7 states that a priest cannot marry a zonah, a halah, or a divorced woman. The Hebrew text reads, "They shall not take as a wife a zonah, or a defiled woman." Now, what does this mean in its original context? In the ancient world, sexuality and worship were intimately linked. We are not just talking about private immorality. We are talking about ritual prostitution. In Canaan and Phoenicia, sexuality could be part of religious service. The prophet Hosea denounces this starkly in Hosea 4 verse 14, where the people mingle with prostitutes associated with idolatrous practices. In other words, sexual union could become a magical act, an invocation of fertility rite. The Torah understands that the priest is not an isolated individual. He is a living symbol. His home is an extension of the sanctuary. If the Cohen represents purity and separation from syncretism, he cannot be associated with environments where sexuality and magical ritual merge. The Talmud, in Yevamot 61a, analyzes the status of zonah with legal precision. It does not limit itself to a superficial definition. It examines its relationship with pagan practices, with contexts where spiritual identity is compromised. Because this is not just about moral conduct. It is about a theological boundary. Ancient witchcraft did not only operate with objects or with the dead. It also operated with the body, with fertility, with sexual union transformed into a spiritual technique. The Levitical priesthood responds by setting limits, preserving, establishing that holiness cannot be mixed with structures where the sacred has been eradicized and manipulated. And perhaps the lesson for us is subtle but powerful. Not every bond is neutral. Not every environment is spiritually innocent. Identity is also protected through the alliances we choose. Because the priest doesn't only serve at the altar, he serves in his home. And the purity of the sanctuary often begins in the invisible intimacy of the home. There is a law in Leviticus that is often misinterpreted if read out of context. Leviticus 21 verses 17 to 23 states that a Cohen with a physical defect cannot officiate at the altar. He may partake of the offerings. He fully belongs to the priesthood, but he does not perform the ritual service. Let's pause. This is not ontological exclusion. It is functional delimitation. In the ancient world, the anomalous, the grotesque, the physically extraordinary were often considered channels of spiritual power. Magic exploited the strange. The irregular generated fascination. The shaman could display scars, deformities, or marks as signs of connection with invisible forces. The Torah completely reverses that logic. Here, the principle is not the spectacular. It is order. Holiness is not expressed in chaos, but in harmony. The altar is not a stage for dark mystery. It is a space of precise structure, exact measurements, regulated vestments, defined movements. The officiating priest embodies that symmetry. Maimonides, in More Nevi'im 3:45, explains that physical order reflects spiritual order. The whole body symbolizes stability, balance, and wholeness, not because human worth depends on physical perfection, but because public service must visually represent the harmony of the cosmos under divine sovereignty. And here the anti-witchcraft dimension returns. Magic attempts to manipulate hidden forces through the extraordinary. Biblical worship teaches that the divine is revealed in the order established by God, not in the anomaly exploited by humankind. It is a subtle but decisive difference. Holiness does not need the grotesque to impress. It does not need the strange to appear profound. The divine presence manifests itself in proportion, clarity, and balance. And perhaps this law whispers something contemporary to us. Not everything flashy is spiritual. Not everything eccentric is sacred. Sometimes, the true connection with the divine is found in the silent harmony of well-constructed order. Because the altar is not a theater of the bizarre. It is a school of the eternal. Now, There are moments in the Torah where the language ceases to be pedagogical and becomes blunt, without nuance, without metaphors. Exodus 22 verse 17 declares, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." The Hebrew uses the term mekashifa, a practitioner of active magic. This is not innocent superstition. It is the deliberate manipulation of spiritual forces. Leviticus 19 verse 31 adds, "Do not turn to mediums or spiritists." The verb is revealing. Do not turn. That is, do not direct your search in that direction. Because every time someone turns their face toward magic, they are turning it away from God. Leviticus 20 verse 6 further elevates the seriousness. Whoever consults mediums will receive coherent, spiritual separation. It is not only a social offense, it is an ontological rupture. And Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12 presents the formal list: divination, sorcery, enchantments, and consulting the dead, Deresh el Hamadim. And it concludes with a devastating word, abomination. Now let's understand the full structure. These prohibitions aren't floating in a vacuum. They define the mission of the priesthood. Deuteronomy 33 verse 10 declares concerning Levi, "You shall teach Jacob your laws and Israel your Torah." The Kohanim don't just sacrifice, they educate, they set boundaries, they instruct. In the ancient world, magic promised immediate access to power, secret ritual, effective formula, spiritual control. The Torah responds with a radical assertion: power is not manipulated, it is served. The priest is the guardian of that boundary. He teaches that one does not consult the dead, because one consults the living God. That one does not invoke hidden forces, because the revelation was already given at Sinai. And perhaps the most profound lesson is this: magic seduces because it offers control. The Torah educates because it demands trust. The Levitical priesthood was established precisely to safeguard that difference between mastering the invisible or submitting to the invisible. There is a figure in the Torah who takes separation a step further. He is not a Cohen, priest. He is not born into the tribe of Levi. He is a voluntarily chosen one. He is a Nazarite. Numbers 6-6, 7 declares concerning him, "During all the days of his consecration to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body, nor go near his father or his mother. He shall not defile himself." The formula is almost identical to that of the high priest. Let us pause on this. The Nazarite is not an institutional priest. He is an individual who decides to intensify his consecration. And what is one of the central tenets of that intensification? Absolute separation from death. Why? Because in the spiritual architecture of the Torah, death is not a portal of power. It is not a source of revelation. It is not a ritual tool. It is a boundary. It is a rupture. It is a consequence of the human condition. Ancient witchcraft operated precisely at that boundary. It invoked the dead. It sought messages from the underworld. It used human remains as instruments. The Torah responds by creating a counter-paradigm. The higher the level of holiness, the greater the distance from death. The Nazarite radicalizes the anti-witchcraft principle. Not only the Cohen, not only the high priest. The individual who desires to elevate themselves also adopts the same logic. Authentic spirituality is not built by descending into the realm of the dead, but by ascending in life toward God. It is a countercultural message, because human fascination with the occult is constant. But the Torah insists, access to the divine is not achieved by crossing into the underworld, but by disciplining the present. The Nazarite teaches us that holiness is not a dark mystery. It is luminous clarity. It is not the manipulation of shadows. It is the consecration of life. And perhaps therein lies its radicalism, reminding us that true spiritual elevation begins when we stop seeking power in death and learn to find purpose in life.
In Sinai, a rebellion shaped the destiny of the world. What they never explained to you is that golden calf wasn't just idolatry. It also involved the use of dark forces, witchcraft, and magic with metals and alchemy. Today you will discover with the Parashat Ki Tisa the ancestral struggle of the Torah against Avodah Zarah.
There is a literary detail in the Torah that, if we miss it, causes us to lose half the message. Exodus 32 presents the turning point, the golden calf. The bull, the ultimate symbol of Egyptian power, The celebrated Apis, an Egyptian deity, is melted down, elevated, and shamelessly proclaimed. This is your God who brought you out of Egypt. The animal that represented strength, fertility, and dominion becomes a portable deity. But observe what happens immediately afterward. The Torah text doesn't change the subject. It doesn't move on to another story. It lingers with almost obsessive meticulousness on the construction of the Mishkan and the sacrificial system. Exodus 35-40, and then Leviticus 1-7. Exact measurements, precise materials, rigorous procedures. And here lies the structural key. The same animal that was deified will now be brought as an offering. The bull is no longer a god. It is a sacrifice. It is no longer an object of worship. It is an instrument of service. The juxtaposition is not accidental. It is theological. That which was elevated to a deity becomes an act of surrender before the invisible God. Idolatry is not combated with words alone. It is dismantled by reinterpreting its symbol. What was absolutized is relativized. What was worshipped is offered. And so the Torah teaches that true power is not found in the visible object, but in the sovereignty of the invisible. Now let's address the second question of this lesson. How did the temple sacrifices seek to extinguish idolatry? Some interpret the biblical sacrifices as an archaic, almost incomprehensible mystery. And then Maimonides, the Rambam, appears with his rationalist serenity and compels us to think. In More Nevi'im 3:32, Maimonides proposes a bold idea. Sacrifices, he says, are not an end in themselves. They are a historical pedagogy. Israel emerged from Egypt, a civilization where animal worship was central. Sacrifice was the dominant religious language. To expect the people to suddenly abandon that entire symbolic framework would have been psychologically untenable. God, then, does not eliminate the sacrificial impulse. He redirects it. And this opinion of Rambam aligns with the exegesis that in the first Torah revelation, the one Moses tore to save the people from God's wrath, there were no sacrifices in the temple. This was a consequence of the sin of the golden calf, intended to teach a people with a slave mentality and an Egyptian mindset about monotheism. If you understand this, you will then understand why, in the later biblical prophets, God repeatedly tells Israel that he does not want their sacrifices, because it was never God's original plan. It was merely a secondary plan to educate them by having them kill the idols of the time each day. Rambam's conceptual paraphrase is clear. The Eternal permitted forms of worship known to the people, but he transferred them to his service, eliminating their idolatrous orientation. The bull is not honored. It is subordinated. The sacred animal is not celebrated. It is placed on the altar of the invisible God. Let us consider the subtlety. The sacrifice of the bull does not perpetuate the Egyptian cult. It dismantles it. What is sacrificed is precisely what Egypt venerated. And this is a pedagogical strategy. Now let's move on to More Nevi'im 3:46. Here Maimonides is even more explicit. He points out that many ancient peoples attributed divinity to certain animals. By commanding their sacrifice, the Torah publicly demonstrates that they do not possess a divine nature. Imagine the scene in historical terms. The bull, a symbol of cosmic power in Egypt, Apis, is slaughtered on the Israelite altar, not in secret, not with shame, but as the central act of worship. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is political theology. The message is direct. That which you feared as a god, that which you believed to be untouchable, can be offered to the one true God. He has no power of his own. He is not an autonomous entity. He is a creature. Maimonides compels us to understand that the sacrificial system does not perpetuate idolatry. It neutralizes it from within. It takes the dominant religious language and reconfigures it. It preserves the external form, but transforms the content. And here we return to the golden calf. The people wanted to materialize the divine in a bull. The divine response was not to abolish all animal symbols. It was to regulate them, discipline them, and place them under absolute sovereignty. It is a profoundly rational lesson. God educates gradually. He does not destroy human psychology. He redirects it. He does not demand impossible leaps. He transforms cultural habits. But it is also a spiritual lesson. What culture absolutizes, the Torah relativizes. What the environment sacralizes, revelation subjects. Maimonides, with his philosophical mind, shows us that the altar is not a primitive vestige. It is a laboratory that eliminates idolatry. And perhaps the question he leaves us with is contemporary. What are our modern bulls? What cultural symbols have we elevated to the status of untouchables? Divine pedagogy continues to operate in the same way. It does not always destroy the symbol. Sometimes he takes it and places it on the altar. And when that happens, we understand that true spiritual revolution doesn't consist of eliminating culture, but of reordering it under the invisible God. When we reach the Middle Ages, the debate doesn't disappear. It deepens. Nachmanides, the Ramban, in his commentary on Leviticus 1 verse 9, partially disagrees with Maimonides' rationalism. For him, sacrifice is not just historical pedagogy. It has a real mystical dimension. The offerer, he says, must imagine that what happens to the animal should happen to him. The blood represents life. The offering symbolizes substitution and inner expiation. It is a more spiritual, more metaphysical vision. But, and here's the interesting part, Ramban doesn't contradict the central tenet. The sacrificial system eliminates idolatry by centralizing and regulating worship. The animal is not divine. It is not an object of veneration. It is a vehicle of expiation, a means, not an end. The difference between Rambam Maimonides and Ramban Nachmanides is not whether sacrifice combats idolatry. They both agree on that. The difference is whether it also operates on deeper mystical planes. The Sefer HaChinuk, in Mitzvah 95 to 97, offers another complementary layer. It explains that sacrifices correct the erroneous ideas absorbed from Egypt and Canaan. Ritual repetition is not mechanical, it is educational. It shapes the mind. It reconfigures the collective imagination. It teaches, through constant practice, that power belongs solely to God. And Rashi, with his classic acuity, reminds us of the original context. Regarding Exodus 32, he points out that the golden calf was a regression to Egyptian symbols. In Leviticus 9 and 10, he emphasizes that the priestly service inaugurates legitimate worship after the crisis. That is, after the spiritual collapse, the altar becomes a guarantee of order. Thus, rationalists and mystics converge on an essential point. Sacrifice does not perpetuate idolatry. It replaces it. It disciplines it. It transforms it. And perhaps that convergence is the true message. Beyond how we understand the spiritual mechanics of sacrifice, its historical and theological function is clear: to displace the false symbol and restore the true center. The animal ceases to be a god and becomes an instrument of return. To understand the symbolic power of the bull in the Torah, we must mentally travel to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. There, the Apis bull was not merely an animal. It was considered the living manifestation of Ptah and, at certain times, also associated with Osiris. It was not a decorative symbol. It was the incarnate divine presence. It was venerated, cared for, and mummified with royal honors. Now imagine the scene in the Israelite sanctuary. A bull is brought to the altar. It is publicly slaughtered. Its blood is poured out as part of the service to an invisible God. The message is explosive. The bull is not a god. The bull dies before God. This is not a liturgical detail. It is a theological statement. And the Torah itself acknowledges this tension in Exodus 8 verses 22 to 26. When Moses warns Pharaoh that the Hebrew sacrifices would be an abomination to the Egyptians, he is stating something very concrete. What Israel sacrifices is precisely what Egypt considers sacred. In other words, the sacrificial act was not neutral. It was provocative. Sacrificing a bull was not merely fulfilling an internal rite. It was publicly challenging the Egyptian worldview. That is why the golden calf was so serious. It was not simply making a statue. It was returning to the symbol of the oppressor. It was reinstating the religious imagery from which they had just been liberated. The subsequent sacrificial system responds with a radical inversion. The symbol is not entirely eliminated. It is reinterpreted. It is placed under divine sovereignty. The bull, which represented autonomous cosmic force, becomes a creature subject to the Creator. And here lies a lasting lesson. The Torah does not only prohibit idols. It dismantles cultural symbols by elevating them to the proper altar. Because true spiritual liberation does not consist solely of leaving Egypt. It consists of learning that what seemed divine can die before the one true God. There is a detail that often goes unnoticed and yet it is profoundly intentional. After the sin of the golden calf, when the people have already overcome the crisis and the sanctuary is inaugurated, something surprising happens. In Leviticus 9 verse 2, Moses tells Aaron, "Take for yourself a young bull as a sin offering." A young bull, the very symbol of sin, not just any animal, not a symbolically neutral substitute, precisely a young bull. The echo of Exodus 32 is unavoidable. The animal that was melted down, worshipped, and proclaimed, "Your God who brought you out of Egypt is now brought alive to the altar to be sacrificed." The Torah is speaking in deliberate symbolic language. The symbol of error is brought to the place of correction. The instrument of idolatry becomes an instrument of atonement. But note, it is not the animal that redeems. The animal has no power of its own. It is not an autonomous mystical energy. The message is direct and forceful. The animal does not redeem, God redeems. The calf does not save Israel. It does not magically compensate for sin. It is an act of obedience within a system ordained by the eternal. The efficacy does not reside in the blood as a magical substance, but in the restored relationship with the invisible God. And here we understand divine pedagogy. The very symbol that was absolutized is humbled. The very object that was called God is placed on the altar as a creature. The symbol is not destroyed by ignoring it. It is transformed by confronting it. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. Our mistakes are not always corrected by fleeing from them, but by taking them to the correct altar, recognizing that what we mistake for power never had it, because the calf dies. But God remains. There is a fundamental difference between idolatry and biblical worship that we don't always perceive. Bull idolatry implied that power resided in the object itself. The animal was sacred in and of itself. It supposedly possessed inherent energy. It was enough to touch it, invoke it, manipulate it. The Torah responds by eliminating all autonomy of the object. Deuteronomy 12 establishes that sacrifices cannot be made just anywhere, only in the place God chooses. There are no private altars, no spiritual improvisation, no secret domestic ritual. The power is not in the animal, nor in the technique, nor in subjective intention. It is in obedience to the divine command. Leviticus 17 verse 11 states it clearly. "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement." Blood is not a readily available magical substance. It belongs to the altar. It belongs to God. No one can use it for esoteric purposes. This completely changes the spiritual structure. Magic is private and manipulative. It operates in secret. It promises individual control over invisible forces. Biblical sacrifice, on the other hand, is public, regulated, and supervised by priests. It is governed by rules. It is transparent. It is inscribed within a legal system. Magic concentrates power in the practitioner. Sacrifice decentralizes it toward divine law. And here the socio-political dimension emerges. Centralizing worship is not merely a matter of ritual. It is about preventing the emergence of alternative centers of spiritual power. It is about preventing each individual from constructing their own magical system. The altar is not a laboratory of witchcraft. It is a space of order. Because when the sacred becomes manipulable, society fragments. But when worship is subject to rules and supervision, the spiritual ceases to be a tool of domination and becomes service. And that is the true revolution. Power no longer resides in the object, nor in the practitioner. It resides in the will of the invisible God. Now, let's address the third topic we promised in this video, the witches of Ashkelon. The Torah doesn't treat witchcraft as quaint superstition or mere rural folklore. It treats it as a theological crime. Why? Because it's not just a strange practice. It's a religious competition. Exodus 22 verse 17 states unambiguously, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." This isn't symbolic language. It's severe legislation. Leviticus 19 verse 31 warns, "Do not turn to mediums or spiritists." And Leviticus 20 verse 6 adds that whoever does will be subject to coherent, spiritual exile. Later, in 2027, the penalty is emphasized again. Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12 offers the formal list: divination, sorcery, enchantments, consulting the dead. And it concludes with a devastating word: abomination. Why such severity? Because witchcraft isn't just believing in other powers. It's attempting to manipulate spiritual forces outside of divine will. It's operative idolatry, not only a doctrinal error, but a practical attempt at control. Biblical monotheism affirms that power belongs exclusively to the invisible God. Magic proposes a shortcut. The Torah calls it theological betrayal, and therein lies its severity. Because when humankind tries to dominate the invisible, it ceases to serve God and begins to compete with him. There is a passage in the Talmud that bursts forth like a legal news item within a technical discussion. We are in the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 45b. The Gemara is analyzing the law of hanging, the post-execution hanging, based on Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 to 23. To whom does it apply? Does it also apply to women? And suddenly a surprising historical fact appears. Shimon ben Shetach hanged 80 women in Ashkelon. 80 women. Ashkelon. The discussion isn't recounting a sensational story. It's resolving a halakhic objection. If Shimon ben Shetach hanged women, it would seem that hanging also applies to them. But the Gemara's answer is decisive. That case does not constitute normative proof. Why? Because it was an Oriyat Shah, an emergency measure. The sages explain that Ashkelon was experiencing a social plague of witchcraft. Not an isolated case, not a minor suspicion, an expansion that threatened the spiritual and legal fabric of the community. The action was exceptional, extraordinary, designed to stem a crisis. And here we understand something fundamental. The Talmud does not turn the episode into a rule. It defines it. It frames it. It recognizes it as a temporary intervention in the face of a theological threat. This fits perfectly with the biblical framework we have seen. Witchcraft was not treated as innocent superstition, but as active religious competition. When it spread, it undermined practical monotheism. However, the rabbinic system is careful. It does not normalize the exception. It does not legislate out of panic. It distinguishes between a permanent norm and an emergency measure. Ashkelon does not redefine halakha. It reveals the gravity of the crisis. And perhaps that is the most mature lesson of the passage. Even in the face of a real spiritual threat, the law must remain aware of its own limitations. Justice cannot be transformed into uncontrolled impulse. The Torah combats witchcraft, but it does so through structure, not hysteria. Because even in times of crisis, order must prevail over chaos. Now we turn to the extended version, preserved in the Jerusalem Talmud. There, the story takes on a dramatic form. 80 witches in a cave in Ashkelon. It is not an isolated trial. It is a planned operation. Shimon ben Shetach does not act as an impulsive individual. He acts as a public authority, Nasi and Avi Bet Din, responsible for upholding the Torah's validity when society becomes corrupt. The Jerusalem Talmud presents the episode as a moral and political diagnosis. When witchcraft spreads and becomes systemic, leadership must intervene. The scene is significant. A cave, not the temple, not the Beit Midrash, not an open and regulated space. The cave is liminal, clandestine, typical of occult practices. The rabbinic narrative underscores the contrast: secrecy versus publicity, darkness versus law. The plan includes a fascinating detail that is repeated throughout the tradition, lifting the witches from the ground to take away their power. From a historical critical perspective, we are dealing with rabbinic narrative language. It is not a technical manual of magic. It is symbolic pedagogy. Witchcraft appears as a parasitic power operating under specific conditions: isolation, suggestion, fear, secrecy. To remove their foundation is to remove their psychological stage. Then comes the detail that shocks the reader: 80 in one day. Standard halakha establishes that a court does not try 2 capital cases on the same day, much less 80. For this reason, the Babylonian classifies the episode as Oriyat Shah, an emergency measure. It is not ordinary procedure. It is an exceptional intervention to curb a social plague. And then the story takes a tragic turn. After the execution, the families of the condemned women seek revenge. False witnesses emerge against the son of Shimon ben Shetach. The story becomes a warning. Moral leadership comes at a personal cost. Justice can provoke reprisals. Corrupt testimony can destroy lives. Tradition uses this outcome to teach several simultaneous lessons. First, the danger of undermining judicial legitimacy through false testimony. Second, the fragility of authority even when acting out of ethical conviction. Third, the human price paid by those who confront corrupt structures. This is not a sensationalist account. It is a rabbinic construction that articulates theology, politics, and judicial ethics. Witchcraft is not merely private superstition. It is a social phenomenon that erodes spiritual sovereignty. But the response cannot be arbitrary. It must be aware of its exceptional nature. And perhaps that is the most profound teaching of the Yerushalmi. Combating darkness does not immunize one against suffering. Defending the Torah does not guarantee personal immunity. Authentic leadership involves risk. The cave represents the clandestine. The court represents the law. Between the two hangs the spiritual stability of society. And in the end, the message is sober. Holiness requires not only ritual purity, it requires public courage. But it also demands remembering that even necessary measures must remain under the shadow of justice, not impulse. Because when the fight against disorder forgets its own limits, it risks resembling that which it seeks to eradicate. To understand the Ashkelon episode, we need to know who Shimon ben Shetach was. Rabbinic sources and classical Jewish historiography place him as a central figure in Pharisaic leadership during the Hasmonean period, in the 1st century BCE. He was not a fringe agitator. He was a Nasi, a judicial and spiritual authority, with significant institutional activity. A man of law. Context is key. During the Hasmonean era, the tension between the Perushim, the Pharisees, and the Tzaddukim, the Sadducees, profoundly affected legal authority and social control. It was not merely a theological debate. It was a dispute over the legitimate interpretation of the Torah and over who should govern the judicial system. Shimon ben Shetach is remembered as a restorer of the traditional Pharisaic legal order. He reinforced procedures, defended the validity of testimony, and strengthened the structure of the Sanhedrin. In other words, he worked to consolidate normative sovereignty. Within this framework, the Ashkelon episode takes on another dimension. It is not merely a moral crusade against superstitious practices. It is a reaffirmation of legal authority. Witchcraft does not represent only religious error. It represents a parallel spiritual economy, informal courts, and clandestine networks of power. Allowing them to flourish means tolerating alternative systems of legitimacy. That is why the purge must also be interpreted in political and legal terms. Rabbinic Judaism does not accept hidden powers outside the framework of the Torah. It does not recognize magical intermediaries or private spiritual jurisdictions. Shimon ben Shetach does not act merely as a moralist. He acts as an architect of the legal order. And thus we understand that the fight against witchcraft is not simply a battle against the strange. It is a defense of the spiritual sovereignty of the community. Because when the law loses its centrality, the void is filled by shadows. Now we must ask ourselves a strategic question. Why Ashkelon specifically? Ashkelon in Greco-Roman sources, was a key port city on the Mediterranean coastal corridor during the Second Temple period. It wasn't a marginal village. It was a commercial hub, a transit point between Egypt, Judea, and the Hellenistic world. And port cities have a constant characteristic throughout history. They concentrate exchange, not only of goods, but also of ideas, rituals, and gods. Where there is a port, there is syncretism. Ashkelon was marked by a strong Hellenistic influence. In the Mediterranean of that era, mystery cults, invocation practices, astrology, and various forms of magic were commonplace. We're not talking about medieval caricatures. We're talking about a religious ecosystem where the magical and the philosophical coexisted. Rabbinic Judaism, in that context, wasn't reacting to imaginary phantoms. It was engaging in polemics against a concrete cultural reality. That is why the Torah had already established explicit prohibitions. Deuteronomy 18 lists magical practices. Leviticus 19 and 20 warn against soothsayers and fortune tellers. Ashkelon, as a multicultural port city, represented the perfect laboratory for these kinds of phenomena. Now let's add another narrative detail from the Jerusalem Talmud. The story describes a community where public honor has been inverted. A tax collector is met with widespread mourning, while a sage is despised. The moral order is disrupted. Values are confused. And tradition connects this decadence with the tolerance of witchcraft. This is not a literary coincidence. It is a social diagnosis. When prestige shifts from the Torah to economic power or to spectacle, marginal practices gain legitimacy. Magic flourishes where normative authority weakens. In a border city, open and commercial, the risk of mixed religious practices increases. The port brings not only wheat and wine, it brings foreign gods. It brings esoteric techniques. It brings promises of alternative power. Shimon ben Shattak operates within this context. Ashkelon is not randomly chosen in rabbinic memory. It is a symbol of cultural borders, of permeability, of the tension between identity and assimilation. And here the deepest dimension emerges. The problem is not cultural diversity itself. The problem is the loss of center. When there is no clear normative axis, syncretism becomes dilution. The Torah, from Sinai, insists on something radical. One cannot serve God and simultaneously seek power in parallel systems. One cannot maintain the altar and tolerate the cave. Ashkelon represents this crossroads. And perhaps the question it leaves us with is not archaeological, but contemporary. Where are Ashkelons? What are our cultural hubs today, where seductive ideas circulate, promising rapid access to spiritual power? Rabbinic history does not demonize the city for its commerce. It points to the risk of losing one's bearings. Because when public honor is inverted, when spectacle trumps truth, when secrecy gains prestige, the community enters into crisis. And then, as in Ashkelon, the leadership must decide whether to tolerate the dissolution or reaffirm the center. The port city is not the enemy. The loss of spiritual sovereignty is. And that lesson, like so many in our tradition, continues to resonate in every generation that lives on the border between identity and assimilation. When the sages analyze the Ashkelon episode, they introduce a fascinating nuance. Not all witches were the same. In the exegetically material related to the Sugya, it is mentioned that some were associated with Ov and others with Yidoni. Let's examine these categories. The Torah mentions them explicitly. Do not turn to mediums or spiritists. Leviticus 19 verse 31 and Leviticus 20 verse 27 establishes the death penalty for anyone who practices these forms of spiritism. What is Ov? Tradition associates it with the evocation of spirits, often described as a voice that arises from the womb, a medium who channels what they claim comes from the dead. And Yidoni? It is linked to practices of invocation through specific objects or rituals, another way of accessing the afterlife. Now, if there were different categories in Ashkelon, we are dealing with different crimes. And this reinforces the Talmudic idea that it was not a regular process. Ordinary halakha demands legal precision. Different cases are not grouped into a single mass trial. The classification itself underscores the exceptional nature of the case. But beyond the procedure, there is a profound conceptual reading. Ov and Yidoni represent the intrusion of the dead into the order of the living God. They are not simply superstitions. They are attempts to open an alternative channel of revelation. And here lies the theological fracture. The Torah establishes a radical distinction between prophecy and mediumship. Prophecy is divine initiative. The prophet does not control the message. He receives it. The medium seeks to provoke the manifestation, to activate it, to manipulate it. This is the difference between revelation and technique. Revelation descends from the will of God. Manipulation ascends from the human desire for control. That is why the Torah does not treat Ov and Yidoni as minor errors. It places them under the most severe penalties, because they break the essential boundary between holiness and occultism. Holiness accepts limits. It awaits the divine word. Occultism attempts to force it. In theological terms, it's not just consulting a dead person. It's redefining the source of spiritual authority. It's shifting the focus from the living God to an instrumentalized beyond. And perhaps that's why the Ashkelon story emphasizes the gravity of the phenomenon. It wasn't harmless folklore. It was structural competition against the model of revelation. The Torah doesn't just prohibit magic. It defends the invisible boundary that protects the difference between listening to God and attempting to use the invisible. And that boundary, even if the names change, remains crucial in every generation. Now we enter a delicate point, and we must approach it with precision. When the Talmud recounts the Ashkelon episode, It is not legitimizing an arbitrary hunt. It is not promoting mass hysteria or uncontrolled persecution. The Gemara itself acknowledges that the event is incompatible with ordinary procedure. 80 executions in a single day contradict standard practice. Halakha stipulates that a court does not try multiple capital cases simultaneously, much less ones of that magnitude. This is why the Babylonian Talmud explicitly frames it as Oriat Shah, an emergency measure. What does this mean? It means that, faced with an extreme social threat, the Sanhedrin can exercise exceptional power for the purpose of deterrence and restoring order. It does not create new law. It does not alter the established norm. It acts to preserve the system when it is at risk of collapse. Modern commentators on the Daf emphasize precisely this tension. The account clashes with ordinary procedure, and this very friction is the key to interpretation. The exceptional proves the rule. This is fundamental to avoiding historical misunderstandings. Rabbinic tradition does not promote indiscriminate persecution. In fact, the evidentiary system in capital cases is extraordinarily rigorous. Witnesses are thoroughly examined. Prior warning is given. Judicial deliberation takes place. The Orayat Shah is not a license for panic. It is a limited tool for restoring normative sovereignty when the social fabric is threatened. And here the anti-witchcraft reading emerges, which we must understand clearly. Magic operates in secrecy. It feeds on secrecy. It promises hidden power. It generates fear. It creates parallel networks of authority. The Torah and Halakha seek precisely the opposite: to replace the clandestine with the public, to replace the manipulable with the regulated, to replace fear with legal authority. The altar is in the center of the camp, not in the cave. The Sanhedrin tribunal deliberates openly, not in esoteric whispers. Blood belongs on the altar, not in private rituals. When the legal order weakens, the occult gains ground. When normative authority is reaffirmed, the shadow loses space. The lesson is profound and contemporary. Judaism does not combat magic by creating more magic. It combats it by strengthening the law, transparency, and public accountability. And that is the true difference between justice and a witch hunt. A witch hunt is born of fear. Ora'at Shah, the law of the land, is born of the need to preserve order. One is impulsive. The other is exceptional and limited. Because even when facing what it perceives as a grave spiritual threat, tradition insists on something radical. The response must remain legal, structured, and aware of its own limits. And perhaps that is the most mature lesson of the entire episode. The antidote to darkness is not fury. It is the law. And before we finished, there was a question we haven't yet answered about the power of metals, alchemy, and spirituality. There's something fascinating about gold. It shines without oxidizing. It doesn't corrode. It doesn't lose its luster. Throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages, it was considered more than just a metal, a symbol of perfection, permanence, and power. And in certain systems, even a carrier of supposed energies. But we must distinguish three levels precisely. First, the historical religious level. Many cultures attributed magical value to metals. In Mesopotamia and the Greco-Roman world, talismans were made of gold for protection and power, of silver associated with the moon, of copper linked to Venus, and of iron used as a defense against spirits. The so-called sympathetic magic was at work, like influences like. The metal wasn't always worshipped as a god, but it was treated as a bearer of cosmic force. Second, the alchemical level. In medieval alchemy, both Islamic and European, metals were combinations of basic principles, sulfur and mercury, according to Arab theory. Gold was the perfect state of matter. The goal was to transmute base metals into gold, to find the philosopher's stone, to achieve a parallel spiritual purification. In some contexts, it was proto-chemistry, in others, esoteric mysticism. And third, the Jewish exegetically plane. Here, something radical occurs. In Exodus 32, the calf is made of gold. The text is not naive. The most perfect metal of the ancient world is chosen to represent a visible deity. Gold concentrates precisely what witchcraft exploits: permanence, value, sensory fascination. And what does the Torah do? Moses burns it, grinds it, and scatters it in water. Exodus 32, verse 20. The symbolism is unequivocal. Gold is not sacred. It is dust. Idolatry is not just sculpture. It is attributing autonomous power to matter. You shall not make for yourself an image. Exodus 20 verse 4 does not prohibit art. It prohibits deification. And here the difference with the Mishkan is abysmal. The gold of the sanctuary, Exodus 25 to 28, is not magical. It does not possess intrinsic energy. It is material consecrated by divine command. In idolatry, gold is a god. In the temple, gold serves God. Maimonides is unequivocal. In More Nevi'im 3, he explains that objects do not possess inherent spiritual power. In Hilchot Avodah Zarah, he condemns attributing independent power to material elements. His position is unequivocal. Matter does not mediate the divine except by explicit command of the Torah. Any efficacy attributed to amulets or metals is, at best, psychological or an intellectual error. Nachmanides, more open to a metaphysical dimension, also does not grant autonomy to metals. Even in mystical interpretations, energy flows by divine will, not by any magical quality of gold. In later Kabbalistic literature, metals can symbolize sphirot, but a symbol is not manipulable power. Holiness depends on obedience and moral purity, not on the chemical composition of the object. The problem, then, is not chemical. It is theological. Gold in the Bible appears associated with idolatry, corrupting wealth, as in Ezekiel 7 verse 19, and human pride. It symbolizes self-sufficiency, the illusion that something created can sustain itself. The Torah dispels that illusion. It burns the calf. It pulverizes the gold. It returns it to the state of dust. Because when matter is absolutized, humanity kneels before what it should be using. And that is the final lesson. Jewish tradition does not deny the beauty of gold. It denies its divinity. It does not prohibit the metal. It prohibits the illusion that power resides in it. Matter is not an autonomous mediator. Brilliance is not transcendence. Metal is not sacred energy. Only the Creator is the source. And as long as we remember that, gold will remain what it always was, a shiny creature, but a creature nonetheless. Thank you for reading this far. We have come a long way. From the golden calf to Ashkelon, centuries of history. From Sinai to the rabbinical court. And now we can come full circle. The central thesis of this series is clear. The Levitical priesthood did not arise in the abstract. It arose as a structural response to idolatry and witchcraft, as an institutional antidote to the human temptation to manipulate the divine. The Torah does not minimize witchcraft. It defines it as an abomination in Deuteronomy 18. It is not treated as folklore. It defines it as a theological competence. That is why it prescribes the maximum penalties. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Exodus 22 verse 17. A man or woman who practices witchcraft or sorcery shall surely be put to death. Leviticus 20 verse 27. Why such severity? Because magic proposes an alternative spiritual model, not receiving divine will, but activating it, not submitting to the covenant, but forcing access to power. The Levitical system responds by constructing a different world, a Mishkan with precise dimensions, a temple with regulated services, Kohanim and Levites with strict purity laws, a sacred calendar that orders time. In that world, the spiritual is not taken. It is received, under covenant, under rule, under authority. The priest does not improvise rituals. He does not invoke hidden forces. He does not consult the dead. He teaches Torah. He distinguishes between pure and impure. He centralizes worship to avoid magical fragmentation. After the golden calf, the lesson was painful. When the people seek a manipulable power, they create an idol. The divine response was not to eliminate all mediation. It was to institute regulated mediation. The altar replaces the cave. The court replaces the esoteric whisper. The law replaces fear. And then Ashkelon appears as a historical mirror. A port city, multicultural, permeable to syncretism. A place where witchcraft becomes normalized. Where the clandestine gains prestige. Rabbinic tradition does not turn this episode into a permanent rule. It frames it as Oreat Shah, an exceptional measure. But the message is clear. When witchcraft becomes a social structure, the authority of the Torah must respond firmly to restore order. It is not hysteria. It is a defense of spiritual sovereignty. Because witchcraft is not just a private practice. It is a parallel system of power. And biblical monotheism does not tolerate parallel powers. That's how it all fits together. The Levitical priesthood is more than ritual. It is anti-witchcraft architecture. Purity is not a hygienic obsession. It is a theological boundary. Sacrifice is not blood magic. It is the subordination of the symbol to the Creator. The Torah constructs a universe where human beings learn to serve, not to manipulate. And perhaps that is the most relevant lesson of all. In every generation, the temptation to domesticate the sacred reappears, to turn the spiritual into technique, to seek shortcuts. The answer remains the same as in the desert. God is not to be controlled. The invisible is not to be invoked to dominate it. One enters into a covenant. One accepts limits. One lives under the law. The Levitical priesthood was not a tribal privilege. It was a spiritual bulwark. Remember to subscribe to the Mishnah TV channel, share this content, give us a like, visit our website laymishnah.com, and below are a couple of videos for you to continue studying with us. Shalom, shalom.